The Mafia boss thought his enemies were gone, until the black waitress warned, "They found you." Dante Romano was the king of New York's underworld, a man whose mere name could send chills down the spine of even the most hardened criminals. He had everything: power, wealth, and respect. For years, he had held the reins of his empire, carefully navigating a world full of dangerous enemies. But today, as he stood in his luxurious penthouse, overlooking the sparkling skyline of Manhattan, he felt an unsettling calm. His enemies were supposed to be gone. The last few months had been filled with victories, his rivals defeated, his allies solidified, and his rule uncontested. But something felt off. It was too quiet. It was too peaceful. The silence felt like the calm before the storm. Dante's thoughts were interrupted when he heard the soft click of the door opening. He didn't turn around, already knowing who it was. It was her, Jasmine, the black waitress who had been working at his favorite restaurant for months. Dante had always appreciated her presence, her quiet confidence, and the way she seemed to glide through the world without anyone noticing her. But today, something in her eyes told him that something was wrong. Jasmine stood at the threshold, her face pale, her hands trembling as she held a small envelope in her hand. She was nervous, but her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made Dante pause. Without a word, she stepped into the room and approached him. The faint hum of the city below seemed distant, almost irrelevant, as he watched her carefully. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. Jasmine swallowed hard, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "They found you, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "I overheard them. They're coming for you. They've been watching you, waiting for the right moment." Dante's heart skipped a beat. He had been certain that his enemies had been eliminated, that his empire was safe. But Jasmine's words hit him like a cold wave, flooding him with the realization that he had been wrong. For a moment, he was speechless. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in around him as the weight of her warning settled in. His mind raced, replaying the past few months in a frantic search for any signs he might have missed. But it was all too much to process, too much to understand. "How do you know this?" Dante finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jasmine's gaze didn't falter as she stepped closer to him. "I overheard them, sir. They're planning something big. They think they have the upper hand, but I don't think they realize who they're dealing with." Her words rang in Dante's ears, her warning echoing through the silence of the room. He knew he had to act fast. His enemies were closer than ever, and they were more dangerous than he had anticipated. The calm he had once felt was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. It was time to prepare for war. And Jasmine, the quiet waitress who had no business being involved in this world of power and violence, was the one who had saved him. For now, he had to trust her. But the question lingered in his mind. How had she known? And who else might be watching him right now? The room was eerily silent as Dante Romano processed Jasmine's warning. His fingers, cold and steady, gripped the edge of his desk, the smooth mahogany betraying none of the tension that flooded his veins. He had built his empire with precision, with ruthless force, and now it was teetering on the edge of collapse. Jasmine, the unassuming waitress who had served him countless times without drawing attention, had just shattered the illusion of security that he had spent years constructing. For a moment, Dante's mind raced with questions. How had she come by this information? Why was she so sure? But in the midst of the questions, a deeper realization began to settle in. He had underestimated his enemies. And now, they were closer than ever. He turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice cold, but with an undercurrent of urgency. Jasmine's eyes darted to the floor for just a moment before meeting his gaze again. "I don't know their names, but they've been tracking you. I overheard a conversation at the diner last night. They're planning something big, something that could take everything from you." Dante felt his stomach twist. His mind instantly flashed to the past, to the countless rivals he had crushed underfoot. He had thought himself untouchable. But this felt different. Jasmine took a step closer, her hands still trembling slightly. "They were speaking in code, but I understood enough. They've been planning for months. They've been waiting for the perfect moment. They think you're weak. They think you've let your guard down." Dante's eyes narrowed. He had never been one to leave himself open to attack, but perhaps he had missed something. Maybe he had become too comfortable. The war was supposed to be over, But this was only the beginning of a new battle. What do you suggest I do? Dante asked, his voice now firm. Jasmine hesitated, then spoke quietly, but with an unmistakable strength in her tone. You need to act fast. You need to prepare for whatever they're planning, or it will be too late. They won't give you a chance to react. Dante stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the room. His fingers drummed against the desk for a moment as he weighed her words. He had never been one to follow anyone's advice, especially not someone like Jasmine. She was just a waitress, after all, a woman with no experience in his world. Yet, there was something about her, something in the way she had warned him, that made him believe her. I will take care of this, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned toward the window, looking out at the skyline of Manhattan. The city that had been his for so long now felt foreign, dangerous. But he wouldn't show weakness. He couldn't. Not in front of anyone, especially not in front of Jasmine. His enemies, whoever they were, would learn that the true power of the Mafia boss was not in the empire he had built, but in the ruthlessness with which he protected it. Thank you, Dante said, his voice softer than it had been before. Jasmine nodded, a slight smile crossing her lips. I just want you to be careful. They're already here, Dante. They've been watching you. Dante's gaze lingered on the city outside, his mind already formulating a plan. They won't get the chance, he replied, his voice cold as ice. His next move was crucial. He needed to find out who these enemies were, what they wanted, and how they had infiltrated his life so deeply. And he would do whatever it took to protect everything he had worked so hard for. Go home, Jasmine, he said. Don't talk to anyone else about this. I will handle it from here. Jasmine hesitated for a moment before nodding and turning to leave. As she reached the door, Dante called after her. Jasmine. She stopped and turned back to him, her expression cautious. You did the right thing. Don't forget that. She nodded again, a small glimmer of relief in her eyes before she exited the room. Dante stood there, alone, the weight of the world on his shoulders. The calm he had once felt was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp edge of danger. He knew that his enemies were still out there, waiting. But now, they would soon learn that when you go up against the Mafia boss, you are playing a dangerous game. And Dante Romano never lost. The tension in Dante Romano's penthouse was palpable. The words Jasmine had spoken still hung in the air, an ominous warning that stirred something deep within him. The quiet hum of the city outside seemed a distant sound as his mind raced through every possibility. Who were these enemies? How had they managed to get so close to him? His empire, which he had built from nothing, had always been impervious to outsiders. Yet, the fact that someone like Jasmine, a mere waitress, could know about his vulnerabilities made it clear that his world wasn't as secure as he thought. Dante knew he had to act fast. He wasn't one to be caught off guard. Every piece of his empire, from the smallest street-level dealer to the powerful allies in the business world, had been carefully placed to ensure his reign. But now, cracks were beginning to form. The stakes were higher than ever, and he had no time to waste. He reached for his phone, dialing his most trusted confidant, Marco. I need you to set up a meeting. Right now? We have a situation, he said, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of urgency. Marco, always quick to respond, didn't hesitate. I'll get things moving, boss. Don't worry. Dante hung up, his eyes still locked on the city below. For years, he had been the one pulling the strings, controlling everything from behind the scenes. But now, it was clear that someone else had been pulling theirs. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp sound of footsteps approaching. Jasmine stepped into the room again, her demeanor more composed this time. She had a quiet strength about her that Dante hadn't noticed before, but now he understood why she was the one to warn him. You were right, he said, his voice calm but firm. They're coming, and we need to be ready. Jasmine nodded, her expression unreadable. I didn't mean to get involved, she said softly, her voice betraying the vulnerability she had hidden behind her tough exterior. But when I overheard them, I knew I had to say something. I couldn't just let it happen. Dante studied her for a moment. He could sense the fear beneath her calm facade. But there was something else there too. Something that told him she wasn't just another scared bystander. She was stronger than she looked. You did the right thing, Dante said, his tone reassuring. But you need to be careful. These people won't hesitate to hurt anyone in their way. Jasmine shifted uneasily but held his gaze. I understand, but I'm not afraid of them. Dante raised an eyebrow, surprised by her confidence. I like that, he said with a slight smile. But don't let it fool you. We're dealing with dangerous people. This isn't some street fight. They've been planning this for a long time. Jasmine swallowed hard, her gaze never leaving his. I know. I heard enough to know that they've been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Dante took a deep breath and turned his attention back to the city. Then we'll make sure they don't get that chance. The plan had to be executed with precision. He needed to figure out who these enemies were, how they had infiltrated his life, and why they were coming for him now. But he also needed to prepare for the worst. Dante had never relied on anyone, but Jasmine's warning had shown him that sometimes, the most unlikely people could be the ones to help you survive. You stay out of this for now, Dante said, his tone brokering no argument. I'll take care of everything. But don't go anywhere. Not yet. Jasmine hesitated but nodded. I won't leave. Dante's eyes softened slightly, a rare moment of vulnerability breaking through his otherwise icy demeanor. Good. I'll need your help soon. I trust you. Jasmine's eyes flickered with something Dante couldn't quite place. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, a shared understanding of the danger that loomed over them both. As she left the room, Dante stood there, staring at the skyline once again, his mind racing through the next steps. He knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take what he had built. Not now, not ever. The game had changed, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. Dante had always been the one in control, and he intended to stay that way. But now, the stakes were higher than ever, and every move he made would need to be flawless. The enemies who thought they had the upper hand were about to learn that Dante Romano never lost. Dante stood by the large windows of his penthouse, the city stretching out beneath him in a vast expanse of lights and shadows. It was supposed to be his empire, his kingdom, but now he felt like a cornered animal, with enemies closing in from every direction. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Marco entered, his expression grim. The meeting's set. They'll be here in 30 minutes, Marco said, his voice low, filled with the weight of the situation. Dante nodded, his face hardening. Good. It's time to deal with this. Once and for all. Marco hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. Are you sure about this? We don't know who they are, or what they really want. Dante turned to face him, his gaze cold but unwavering. I know exactly what they want. They want power. They want what I have. And they think they can take it from me. They're wrong. The determination in Dante's voice cut through the air like a blade. Marco nodded but remained silent, knowing better than to argue with Dante once his mind was made up. The two men moved quickly, preparing for the meeting. Dante knew it wasn't going to be easy. Whoever was behind this had been planning it for months, possibly years. They had infiltrated his world, watched him closely, and now they were ready to strike. But Dante had a plan of his own. He wasn't going down without a fight. As the clock ticked down, Dante's mind flashed back to the moment Jasmine had warned him. How had she known? What had tipped her off? She was just a waitress. But there was something about her, something that had gotten under his skin. She wasn't just a scared woman trying to protect herself. She was a person who had seen something bigger than herself. He could sense it. She had seen a threat, and for some reason, she had come to him. Dante shook his head, pushing aside the thoughts of Jasmine for the moment. There was no time for distractions. His enemies were coming, and he needed to be ready. He and Marco left the penthouse, stepping into the sleek black car waiting outside. The engine roared to life, and the car sped through the streets of Manhattan. Dante's thoughts were laser-focused on the meeting ahead. It would be a showdown, that much was certain. But the question remained, who were these enemies? The thought gnawed at him, but he refused to let it show. The car pulled up to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The place was desolate, a stark contrast to the opulence Dante was used to. As they entered, Dante's senses were on high alert. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes locking onto the shadows. There, standing in the dim light, were his enemies. Dante's jaw clenched. He recognized them, but they didn't know him as well as they thought. So, the great Dante Romano finally shows up. A voice echoed from the darkness. The man stepped forward, his features partially obscured by the low light, but Dante could see enough to recognize him. It was Vito Santoro, a rival boss who had once tried to move in on Dante's territory. But Dante had made sure he wouldn't be a problem again. Apparently, Vito had other plans. You've been hiding, haven't you? Vito continued, his voice laced with mockery. But don't worry, we'll make this quick. It's time for you to step aside. Dante didn't flinch. You're the one who's been hiding, Vito. Hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Well, now you've got your moment. Dante's voice was steady, full of authority. He wasn't about to let Vito or anyone else take what he had worked so hard for. The tension in the room thickened, the air charged with the promise of violence. Marco stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. Dante gave him a subtle nod, signaling him to stand down, for now. This isn't going to end the way you think, Vito, Dante said, his eyes narrowing. You've made a big mistake. You've underestimated me. Vito's smirk faltered, just for a second. He was trying to maintain control, but Dante could see the crack in his facade. The fear was there, and it would only grow. We'll see about that, Vito spat, taking a step back. I've got men in place. We've already won. Dante's eyes locked onto him with cold fury. You've lost before you even started. The room fell silent. Every second felt like an eternity. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, as if it, too, was waiting for the storm to break. Dante took a slow step forward, his voice calm but filled with a deadly promise. You thought you could take everything from me. You thought I was vulnerable. But you're wrong. This is my city, and I don't lose. The finality in his voice was undeniable. Vito shifted uneasily, but the look on his face told Dante everything he needed to know. His enemies were rattled, and Dante Romano would never back down. The air in the warehouse was thick with tension, a silent promise of violence hanging between Dante and Vito. The words exchanged were only the beginning. Dante's sharp gaze never left Vito as the man tried to regain his composure. Vito's bravado was starting to crumble, and Dante could see it. He knew this wasn't the end, not yet. Vito had underestimated him, just like everyone else who ever tried to challenge him. Dante could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had worked too hard for this, built everything from the ground up. No one was going to take it from him. You've made your move, Vito, Dante said, his voice low and controlled. But this is where it ends. Not with you on top, not with you getting what you want. Vito sneered, trying to mask his discomfort with a forced grin. You think you can stop us, Dante? You've lost your edge. You've been too comfortable at the top. You've let your guard down. Dante stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his presence overpowering. You think I've lost my edge? You're wrong. I've never been more focused. You're the one who's out of your depth. Vito's smirk faltered. The hint of uncertainty in his eyes wasn't something Dante missed. The man had been around long enough to know when he was facing a losing battle. Marco, standing silently behind Dante, shifted his weight, clearly ready to act if necessary. Dante gave him a subtle nod, signaling him to stay back for now. He didn't need anyone to fight his battles. He could handle Vito and his crew alone. Vito's face twisted in frustration. You're making a mistake, Dante. You don't know what's coming. You're just too arrogant to see it. Dante stood tall, his eyes cold as steel. The only mistake here is thinking that you can take what's mine. His words cut through the air, and for a brief moment, the room was completely still. Then, without warning, Dante motioned for Marco to follow him. The two men made their way to a corner of the warehouse where the rest of Vito's men were gathered. Dante's eyes scanned the faces in the shadows. These weren't the type of people who would just back down. But Dante wasn't worried. He had been in worse situations before, faced enemies who were smarter, stronger, and better prepared. But he always came out on top. You're making a big mistake, boss, one of Vito's men said, stepping forward. He was tall, with a thick beard and tattoos that covered his arms. You can't fight all of us. Dante's lip curled into a small, mocking smile. I don't need to fight all of you, he said, his voice calm, but with a deadly edge. I just need to make sure you all understand who you're dealing with. The man hesitated, then glanced at Vito, who was still standing at the center of the room. The uncertainty in his eyes was enough to tell Dante that the power dynamic was already shifting. Vito wasn't as in control as he thought. Dante could feel the tides turning in his favor. Vito stepped forward, trying to regain his composure. You're making a mistake, he repeated, his voice growing more desperate. You think you can scare me? You think you can intimidate me with your threats? Dante didn't flinch. He had seen it all before. This was the moment when his enemies realized they had underestimated him. The moment when the tables turned and they knew they were outmatched. You think I'm threatening you? Dante asked, his voice dripping with disdain. No, I'm telling you the truth. You've lost. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation. Vito's men stood still, unsure of what to do next. Dante's words had left them rattled, and Vito, the man who had once been a powerful rival, was starting to look more and more like a cornered animal. Dante could see it in his eyes. The fear, the realization that he was no longer in control. It was a feeling Dante knew all too well. The tables had turned, and there was no way back for Vito. Dante stepped even closer, until he was almost nose to nose with his rival. You can leave now, Vito, Dante said, his voice low but filled with finality. I won't kill you. But if you don't walk out of here now, I won't be so merciful next time. Vito's eyes flickered with panic, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. He knew he had no choice. This isn't over, Dante, he said, his voice shaking. You haven't seen the last of me. Dante's expression remained unchanged. Maybe, he said, but you won't be a problem for me again. With that, Vito and his men retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the night. Dante stood there for a moment, the weight of the victory settling over him. But there was no time to celebrate. He had sent a message, but the war wasn't over yet. And as he turned to Marco, the realization hit him. There was still more to come. But Dante Romano wasn't afraid. He was ready for whatever came next. Dante watched as Vito and his men disappeared into the night, retreating like the beaten dogs they were. The victory was his, but the war was far from over. The silence in the warehouse felt thick, almost suffocating. It had been a long time since he had faced such a challenge, and Dante was beginning to realize how much he had underestimated his enemies. They weren't just trying to take his empire. They were trying to break him, to make him question everything he had built. But Dante wasn't the type to back down, not when everything he had was on the line. As he stood in the dimly lit warehouse, the sound of the city outside faded into the background. His mind raced through the details, the threats, the hidden dangers that still loomed. Vito may have been the first to make a move, but Dante knew that there were more enemies waiting in the shadows. He turned to Marco, who had been silent throughout the exchange, his expression unreadable. What's next? Dante asked, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of the situation. Marco met his gaze, his lips tightening. We find out who's behind this, and we take them down. But you're right, Dante. This isn't over. It's just beginning. Dante nodded, the realization sinking in. It was always like this in his world, one battle after another, each one more dangerous than the last. But Dante had never lost, and he wasn't going to start now. We don't have time to waste, Dante said, his voice sharp with authority. We move fast, we strike first. I want everything on this crew. Names, faces, their connections. I want to know who they are, and I want to know how deep this goes. Marco gave a curt nod. I'll get the information we need. But we need to be careful. Whoever is behind this is playing a long game. They're not making this move without knowing exactly what they're doing. Dante's mind drifted to Jasmine, the black waitress who had saved him from this disaster. He still couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. She had warned him, had seen the threat before anyone else did. And now, she was the only person who truly knew what was going on. He needed her help, but he couldn't afford to trust anyone blindly. He would have to keep his guard up, even with her. I'll handle the rest, Dante said, his voice firm. But you get to work. I don't care how you do it, but I want answers fast. Marco nodded and left, his footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. Dante was alone now, but he didn't feel the peace that usually followed a victory. Instead, he felt the gnawing weight of uncertainty, the unsettling feeling that something worse was still to come. He turned back to the window, looking out over the city. The lights shimmered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch for miles. Dante's mind raced with thoughts of his enemies, his empire, and what was coming next. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his focus. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from Jasmine. They've moved, it read. They're getting closer. Dante's heart skipped a beat. He had known the threat wasn't over, but this was worse than he had imagined. They were already making their move. He quickly typed a response. Where? The reply came moments later. I don't know, but I overheard them. They're planning something big. Something you won't see coming. Dante's pulse quickened. He couldn't let them get the upper hand again. He couldn't afford to wait. He needed to act fast. Dante turned, walking briskly toward the door, his mind already calculating his next move. The enemies he faced weren't just trying to take his territory. They were trying to bring him down, break him in a way that would make him regret every decision he had made. And they wouldn't stop until they had done just that. But Dante wouldn't let them. He couldn't. His empire was everything to him, and no one was going to take it away. As he stepped into the elevator, he made a mental note to meet with his trusted advisors, to make sure every angle was covered. He wasn't going to let anyone outsmart him. He had built his empire on trust, loyalty, and power, and it was time to remind everyone who was in charge. He stepped into the cold night air, the city lights reflecting off the glass buildings that surrounded him. The stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking. Dante Romano wasn't about to lose his empire. Not to Vito. Not to anyone. This war was far from over, and Dante was ready to fight until the end. Dante's pulse quickened as he stood outside the warehouse, the weight of Jasmine's message still hanging in his mind. They're planning something big. Something you won't see coming. The words echoed in his ears like a warning bell, but it wasn't enough to stop him from moving forward. His enemies, whoever they were, had made their play, and now, Dante was determined to make his. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself. As his black car rolled through the streets of Manhattan, his mind raced, calculating every possible angle. He knew his empire wasn't as untouchable as he had once thought. People had been watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It didn't matter if he had defeated rivals before or made a name for himself in this city. If his enemies were patient enough, they could bring him down. But he wasn't about to let that happen. His phone buzzed in his hand, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Marco. I've gathered intel on Vito's men. They're assembling near the docks. They've got backup, and they're armed. The message sent a chill down Dante's spine. The docks were in no man's land, a place where deals went down under the radar, away from prying eyes. If Vito and his crew were regrouping there, it meant they were planning something dangerous. Dante's instincts flared, but he couldn't act recklessly. This had to be calculated. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Dante. Marco's voice came through, tense but steady. They're expecting you. You've got one shot to take them down. I know, Dante replied, his voice like steel. I'll handle it. Meet me there in 30 minutes. Get our people in place. Marco hesitated. Be careful, boss. These people are desperate. They'll fight dirty. Dante could hear the concern in his voice, but he wasn't about to let it show. I know what I'm doing, Marco. Just be ready. He hung up, his grip tightening around the phone. He wasn't afraid of Vito and his crew. He had faced far worse threats in his life. What bothered him was the unknown. He needed to know who was behind this, who had been orchestrating this from the shadows. As the car approached the docks, the air felt different, colder. It was as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. The car came to a stop in front of a warehouse on the edge of the pier. The large metal doors were partially open, and the dim lights spilling out from the inside created an eerie glow. Dante stepped out, his black leather jacket rustling slightly in the breeze. He took a moment to assess the situation. There were no signs of movement, but Dante knew better than to assume the place was empty. His hand went to the gun tucked under his jacket, the cool metal offering him some comfort. Marco arrived a few moments later, followed by a few of their trusted men. They had to move fast. As they approached the entrance, Dante's thoughts returned to Jasmine. Her warning had been a lifeline, but what did she know? How had she learned about the danger lurking around him? He knew he couldn't trust anyone completely, but something about her had stayed with him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than just a waitress. As they entered the warehouse, Dante's sharp eyes scanned the room. The place was mostly empty, save for some crates and a few old shipping containers. But the tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Marco moved toward the far side of the room, signaling the others to cover the exits. Dante slowly moved forward, his steps deliberate. He could hear faint voices, hushed whispers coming from behind one of the containers. He raised his hand, signaling for everyone to stop. It was time. Vito, Dante called out, his voice calm but filled with authority. I know you're here. Don't waste my time. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, Vito stepped out from behind the shadows, his face twisted with rage. You think you've won, Dante? Vito sneered, his eyes flashing with fury. This is just the beginning. You've made a mistake coming here. Dante stood his ground, his expression unreadable. I've made plenty of mistakes in my life, Vito. But coming here wasn't one of them. Vito's men emerged from the shadows, surrounding Dante and his crew. There were more of them than Dante had anticipated, but he wasn't concerned. He knew his men were loyal, and he trusted them to handle whatever came next. I'm not here to talk, Dante continued, his voice colder now. I'm here to end this. Vito's face twisted into a snarl, and he motioned to his men. The room exploded into chaos. Dante was already moving, his instincts taking over as he dodged the first incoming attack. The fight was fierce, quick, and brutal, but Dante was faster. His men were equally skilled, taking down Vito's crew with precision and efficiency. Dante's focus was solely on Vito. He had been waiting for this moment. As Vito tried to make a break for it, Dante grabbed him by the arm, pulling him back. You don't get to run, Vito, Dante growled, his grip tightening. Vito struggled, but Dante was too strong. With a swift movement, Dante slammed Vito against the wall. This is where your empire ends. Vito's eyes flashed with panic, but Dante wasn't interested in his fear. He had a message to send. With one final push, Dante made sure Vito understood. The battle was over. And for Dante Romano, it was just the beginning of taking back control. Dante stood in the dimly lit warehouse. Vito's men sprawled around him, either unconscious or immobilized. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and the acrid scent of adrenaline. Vito, the man who had dared to challenge him, was on the ground, breathing heavily but alive. Dante had never been one for mercy, but he knew when to make a statement. He wasn't interested in just defeating his enemies. He wanted them to understand that crossing him came with a price they could never repay. Vito, blood trickling from his lip, looked up at Dante, his eyes full of defiance despite the obvious defeat. This isn't over, Dante, he spat, his voice full of venom. You can't just end it like this. Dante bent down, bringing his face level with Vito's. You're right about one thing, he said coldly. This isn't over. But you are. Dante stood up, straightening his jacket. Your empire's crumbled, Vito. You're out of the game. He motioned to his men. Take care of the rest. Without another word, Dante turned and walked toward the exit of the warehouse. He didn't need to waste another second on someone who had already lost. As he stepped into the cool night air, his mind was already shifting gears. The fight was over, but the war was far from finished. Vito's defeat was a clear message, but Dante knew that it wasn't enough. There were still people out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. The city was crawling with enemies, each more dangerous than the last. Dante had eliminated one threat, but others would rise in its place. Marco stepped up beside him, his face unreadable. What now, boss? Dante didn't hesitate. Now we find out who's really pulling the strings. He paused, glancing at his right-hand man. Vito was just a pawn. There's someone behind all this. I can feel it. Marco nodded, pulling out his phone. I'll get our people on it. We'll track down every lead we can. You think it's someone close? Dante didn't answer immediately. He couldn't shake the feeling that this had been planned from the inside. A betrayal from someone who knew the ins and outs of his operations. I don't know, Dante said, his voice quiet but filled with determination. But I'll find them. He turned and made his way back to the car, his mind already racing through the possibilities. His thoughts were interrupted by a buzzing in his pocket. He pulled out his phone, expecting another update. But it was something else. A text from Jasmine. They're coming. They know you know. Dante's stomach tightened. He hadn't spoken to her in hours, but her message hit him harder than anything he had felt all night. How had she known? The words "they know you know" echoed in his mind, sending a ripple of unease through him. Someone was watching him, and they weren't finished. He had to move fast. Get to the office, Dante said to Marco, handing him the phone. We're making a move. The drive to his office felt endless, each passing minute weighing heavier on his shoulders. The unease from Jasmine's message clung to him like a shadow, and every turn he made felt like it could be his last. But Dante wasn't a man who ran from danger. He was the one who made danger run. As the car pulled up to his office building, Dante could feel the familiar, sharp edge of focus cutting through the worry. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance, his mind already setting up the pieces for the next phase. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Inside, the place was still. The lights flickered slightly as he made his way to his office, but the silence wasn't comforting. He sat at his desk, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the surface. Marco arrived shortly after, his expression still unreadable. "We've got some movement," Marco said, his voice steady. "There's a crew gathering. It's not Vito's people, but it's related. They're making their move tonight." Dante leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I need to know everything. We can't let them get any closer." He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "And I need Jasmine. She's the only one who's seen something, and we need to figure out what." Marco nodded, already dialing a number. Dante wasn't sure why Jasmine's message had shaken him so much, but he knew it wasn't just about the danger. It was about the fact that she was now involved, and Dante wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a curse. The door to his office opened, and Jasmine stepped inside, her expression tense but resolute. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice quiet but confident. Dante looked up, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. He had underestimated her before, but now, he wasn't so sure. She had something that he didn't, something that made her valuable. "Yes," Dante said, his voice low. "You've been right about everything so far. I need you to keep your eyes open. We've got people on the inside, and they know we're coming for them." Jasmine nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'll do what I can. But you need to be careful. They're planning something big, something you won't expect." Dante leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on hers. "I'm already prepared. But I need you to help me close this chapter." Jasmine stepped closer, her eyes filled with a determination Dante didn't expect. "I'm in. Let's finish this." Dante stood up, a sense of resolve settling over him. The game had changed, and he wasn't going to lose. Not now. Not ever. The air inside Dante's office was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes before a storm. The weight of Jasmine's warning still hung over him like a cloud, but he wasn't about to let fear take control. If anything, it fueled his resolve. He stood at the window, looking out over the city that he had spent years building. It had always been his, but now it felt like he was on the edge of losing it all. Not to Vito, not to his men, but to the unknown. Who else was behind all of this? Who had the resources and cunning to strike from the shadows? Dante's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle, but no matter how hard he tried, the answers eluded him. "We need to move fast," Marco's voice interrupted, pulling Dante back from his thoughts. "The crew we've been tracking, they're not just laying low. They're preparing for something big. Something we need to stop, now." Dante turned to face his right-hand man, his eyes hardening. "What do you mean by big?" Marco didn't flinch. "They're planning to move against you. It's not just about taking over territory. It's about everything, Dante. It's about dismantling everything you've built. They've got people everywhere, all the way up the chain." Dante clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He had always been prepared for this moment, but now, hearing it out loud, it hit him harder than he had expected. His empire, his legacy, was in jeopardy. "Do we have a lead on who's behind it?" Dante asked, his voice low but full of authority. Marco shook his head. "Not yet, but we've got people working on it." Dante nodded. "Keep the pressure on them. I want answers." He paused for a moment, his mind spinning with thoughts of his next move. "I need to see Jasmine. There's something she knows that we don't." Marco raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Dante replied, his gaze drifting back to the window. "But there's something about her. She warned me when no one else would. She's been the only one to see this coming." Marco's expression softened slightly. "You trust her?" Dante didn't hesitate. "Yes." Marco said nothing, but the look in his eyes told Dante he understood. The loyalty of his crew was everything, but sometimes, the most unexpected people could offer the most valuable insight. Dante headed toward the door, his mind focused on what he needed to do next. He wasn't going to let anyone destroy what he had built. Not without a fight. As he reached the car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Jasmine. "They're closer than you think. They're watching you." Dante's pulse quickened, the gravity of her words settling deep within him. He had been preparing for a fight, but now it seemed like the fight had already started. He dialed her number without thinking. The phone rang twice before she picked up. "Dante." Her voice was calm, but there was a trace of urgency beneath it. "You need to be careful. They're not just making moves on the streets. They're going after you directly. I don't know how, but they've got eyes everywhere. Dante's grip on the phone tightened. How do you know this? Because I've seen them. I've heard them talking. They're everywhere. And now they're closing in. There was a long pause before Jasmine spoke again, her voice softer. Dante, you've been too focused on the people you know. You need to think bigger. Whoever is behind this, they've been planning it for a long time. They've been setting you up. Dante stood still, letting her words sink in. He had known that his enemies were crafty, but he hadn't realized just how deep the conspiracy ran. I'm not going down without a fight, Jasmine, he said, his voice firm. I know, she replied. But you have to be ready. They're not going to give up until they've destroyed everything you've worked for. Dante's thoughts raced as he processed what she had said. His enemies were closer than ever, and he had to act now if he was going to protect everything he had built. He had no more time to waste. I need to move, Dante said, his voice cold with determination. I can't waste any more time. I'm coming to you. Jasmine's voice was urgent. Dante, no. You're walking right into their trap. You're not safe. I've been trying to warn you. Dante's grip on the phone tightened again. I don't care, he said, cutting her off. I need to see this through. I won't let them take my empire. He hung up the phone and turned to Marco, who had been standing quietly by the car. We're moving, Dante said, his voice unwavering. I'm going to find out who's behind this. And I'm going to end it, once and for all. Marco didn't hesitate. We'll be with you, boss. All the way. Dante nodded, stepping into the car. The game had changed, and there was no going back. His enemies thought they had him cornered, but they were wrong. Dante Romano wasn't going down without a fight, and he wasn't going to lose. Not now. Not ever. Dante arrived at the abandoned warehouse with the weight of his empire pressing heavily on his shoulders. The lights of the city in the distance seemed so far away now, like a memory of a time when everything felt under control. But now, nothing felt certain. His enemies were closing in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. His phone buzzed again as he stepped out of the car, and he knew it was Marco. We've got to lead on. The men from the docks, Marco said over the line. They're meeting at an old penthouse near the harbor. We don't have much time. Dante's jaw tightened, his thoughts already racing. He had to act fast, but there was no room for error. This had gone beyond a power struggle. Whoever was orchestrating this had done their homework. They knew exactly how to push him to the edge. Dante clicked the phone off and walked toward the entrance of the warehouse, his boots making a sound that echoed in the silent, empty space. Marco, along with a few trusted men, followed closely behind. Inside, the warehouse was cold and abandoned, but Dante could feel the tension in the air. This place had always been a neutral ground, but now, it felt like the calm before a storm. We need answers, Dante said, his voice low and commanding. Find out who's involved. Get everything we can. This isn't just about territory anymore. It's about control. They want to take everything. Marco nodded, then signaled to the others. They dispersed, moving with the precision that Dante had come to expect from his men. The silence returned as Dante stood alone, his thoughts swirling around the situation at hand. Jasmine had been right. His enemies weren't just after his empire. They wanted him broken, stripped of everything he had built. He ran his hand over his face, frustration mounting. He couldn't let that happen. He had come too far, sacrificed too much. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Jasmine. They know you're coming. They're prepared. Dante stared at the message, his grip tightening on the phone. He had hoped for more time. But now, it seemed his enemies were steps ahead. He quickly typed a response. Where? The reply came immediately. The penthouse. They're waiting for you. A chill ran down Dante's spine as he read the message. They had known. They had been waiting. It was a trap. Marco reappeared, his face grim. We've got eyes on the penthouse, he said. They've got heavy security. We're walking into a setup, Dante. Dante exhaled sharply, his mind working quickly. He had to change his approach. Charging in with force would only give them what they wanted, his downfall. He needed to outsmart them. We move at dusk, Dante said, his voice cutting through the tension. We'll come at them from the back. No direct confrontation. I want everything we have on this penthouse. We need to be ready. Marco hesitated. What about Jasmine? He asked. She's the only one who knows what's really going on. Dante thought for a moment before nodding. She stays in the field. If anyone can find the answers we need, it's her. With that, Dante and his men made their way to the back of the warehouse, where their vehicles were parked. As they drove through the darkened streets, Dante's mind was laser-focused. He was closing in on his enemies, but every step was fraught with danger. They knew about him, about his every move. And yet, he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. When they reached the penthouse, Dante's men fanned out, taking positions around the building. The streets were quiet, eerily still. It felt like the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. Dante moved swiftly, his steps measured as he entered the building with Marco and a few of his men. They moved through the hallways, each step calculated, each turn deliberate. They couldn't afford to make a mistake. As they approached the penthouse door, Dante signaled for Marco to wait. He could feel it, the presence of someone waiting on the other side. The door was slightly ajar, the faint light from inside spilling out into the hallway. Dante's hand went to the gun at his side, his fingers tightening around the handle. It was time. He pushed the door open slowly, his gaze scanning the room. But what he saw made his heart skip a beat. The penthouse wasn't empty. It was filled with people, some familiar, some strangers. And in the middle of the room stood someone Dante had not expected. Vito. Alive. He hadn't expected to see him here, but it made sense now. Vito wasn't just a rival. He was a pawn in a much bigger game. The real players were still hidden, but they had made their move. Vito turned to face Dante, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "You've been looking for answers," he said, his voice cold. "Well, here they are." Dante's hand gripped his gun tighter, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. Vito stepped forward, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. "You thought you had this all figured out, didn't you? You were always a step behind." Dante's pulse quickened. He wasn't going to let Vito have the last word. "I'm done playing your game, Vito," he said, his voice hard. "Tell me who's behind all of this. Tell me who's pulling the strings." Vito's grin widened, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of fear. He knew something Dante didn't. But Dante wasn't going to wait for him to speak. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on Vito's. "Tell me now, or I'll make you wish you never crossed me." Dante's eyes never left Vito's face as the tension in the room grew thick. The mocking grin that had spread across Vito's face slowly began to fade, replaced by something more cautious. It was clear that he hadn't expected Dante's unyielding determination. His posture shifted, no longer the cocky, confident criminal boss, but someone who realized that they were no longer in control of the situation. Dante stepped closer, his boots making a quiet sound against the polished floor. "You're done, Vito," Dante said, his voice low and menacing. "Tell me who's behind all of this. Tell me who's been pulling the strings." Vito's lips parted as if he was going to speak, but then he stopped, his eyes darting to the others in the room. The room was filled with men Dante recognized, but they weren't the problem. The problem was Vito's silence. "You really don't know, do you?" Vito said finally, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think I'm the mastermind? You think I'm the one who's been orchestrating all of this?" Dante's patience was wearing thin, but he didn't show it. His hand was still resting on the handle of his gun, and the air in the room felt charged with the promise of violence. "You're a pawn, Vito. A pawn in a much bigger game. Tell me who's playing the board, or I'll make sure you never see the light of day again." Vito swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between Dante and the men around him. It was obvious that the power dynamics had shifted, and Vito was no longer calling the shots. The silence stretched, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, Vito spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've already met him." Dante's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Vito's lips twitched. "You think I would have come this far on my own? There's someone much more powerful than me who's been running things from behind the scenes. And you've already crossed paths with him." Dante's mind raced, trying to process Vito's words. He knew his enemies were ruthless, but he hadn't expected this. He had thought Vito was just another ambitious rival trying to take control. But now, it seemed like he was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. "Who is he?" Dante asked, his voice hard. "His name is Castellano," Vito said, his eyes filled with something Dante couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or regret. "William Castellano. He's the one who's been pulling the strings. He's the one who set all of this in motion." The name hit Dante like a punch to the gut. Castellano. He had heard whispers of the name, but he had never realized just how deep his influence ran. William Castellano wasn't just another player in the game. He was a kingmaker, someone who could move mountains with a single word. "You're telling me," Dante said, his voice low and dangerous, "that everything, this entire war, was because of him?" Vito nodded slowly, his eyes darting to the men in the room who were now watching with growing unease. "He wanted you out of the way. You're a threat to him, Dante. You've been building your empire too strong, too fast. He couldn't let you rise any higher." Dante clenched his jaw. He had spent years building his empire, every decision, every move, meticulously planned. And now, it seemed like it had all been part of Castellano's game from the very beginning. "Where is he?" Dante's voice was a lethal whisper. "Where is Castellano?" Vito hesitated, but then he let out a bitter laugh. "You think you can just waltz into his world and take him down? He's not some petty criminal, Dante. He's been operating in the shadows for years. He's untouchable." Dante's eyes narrowed. He wasn't about to let anyone, no matter how powerful, stand in his way. Not after everything he had fought for. "I'll find him," Dante said, his tone final. "And when I do, it'll be the end of him. Not just the end of his game. The end of him." Vito didn't respond, but Dante could see the fear in his eyes. For the first time, it seemed like Vito understood just how far Dante was willing to go. He wasn't playing by anyone's rules anymore. He wasn't just a boss in the criminal world. He was a force to be reckoned with. As Dante turned and motioned for Marco and his men to follow, he felt the weight of the decision ahead of him. William Castellano was the one pulling the strings, and Dante had no intention of letting him keep the power he had so carefully hidden. But it wouldn't be easy. Castellano was a ghost in the system, someone who had been building his power in the shadows for years. Taking him down wouldn't just be a matter of force. It would require strategy, precision, and the kind of ruthlessness Dante was known for. The game had changed, and the stakes had never been higher. As Dante and his men made their way out of the penthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that the final confrontation was coming. Castellano thought he was untouchable, but Dante was ready to prove him wrong. With each step, the tension built, and the countdown to the final move began. Dante knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to lose. Not now, not ever. Dante's steps were deliberate, his mind focused. He had known from the start that this moment would come, but it didn't make it any easier to face. The pieces were falling into place, but the realization that his empire was at the mercy of a ghost in the shadows sent a chill down his spine. Castellano wasn't just an enemy. He was the kind of figure who operated quietly, with precision and an iron grip on the system. But Dante was prepared. The car ride to Castellano's location was quiet, save for the low hum of the engine. Marco sat beside him, his usual calm demeanor now tinged with anticipation. The closer they got to Castellano's penthouse, the more tense the air became. Dante wasn't just facing another criminal. He was facing a kingpin who had managed to slip under the radar for years. "You know what we're up against," Dante said to Marco, his voice low but commanding. "This isn't just about taking out a rival. Castellano's empire runs deeper than Vito's or anyone else's. He's connected to everything, every corner of this city." Marco nodded. "I know, boss. We've got everything in place, but Castellano isn't someone you can just take down with brute force. He's too strategic, too careful." Dante's gaze never wavered from the road ahead. "We'll have to be more strategic ourselves, then." The car finally came to a stop in front of the towering high-rise. The building was sleek, modern, a clear reflection of Castellano's taste and power. Dante's hand tightened around the handle of his gun, but he knew that a direct confrontation wouldn't be the solution. They had to outsmart him. They had to find a way in without alerting Castellano to their presence. Dante and Marco moved swiftly, their footsteps echoing in the empty parking garage beneath the building. There were no signs of life, no hint that Castellano was aware of their arrival. It almost felt too easy. But Dante didn't trust easy. Easy was how you ended up dead. As they entered the building, the security was tighter than Dante had expected. But Marco had been working in the shadows for years, and with a few quick words and a discreet exchange of currency, they had access to the penthouse floor. The elevator ride was silent, but the tension between them was palpable. Dante's mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. Castellano was a powerful man, but he wasn't infallible. He had weaknesses, and Dante intended to exploit them. The doors opened with a soft chime, and they stepped out into a hallway that felt too still, too quiet. The place was immaculate, too pristine to be a real home. It was clear that Castellano had designed this penthouse to reflect his wealth and status, but there was something cold about it. Dante's eyes scanned the hallway, looking for any sign of life. But it was the silence that was most unnerving. "He's here," Dante said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco nodded, his hand on his weapon. "Let's find him." As they moved through the penthouse, the opulence of the space seemed to mock them. The paintings, the furniture, the expensive decorations, it all seemed so trivial in the face of what they were about to do. Castellano had built his empire on the backs of people like Dante, but now it was time for the tables to turn. The final confrontation was near, and Dante felt every muscle in his body tense in anticipation. Finally, they reached the main living area. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the room. And there, standing by the window, was William Castellano. He didn't turn when they entered, his back still facing them as he looked out over the city. For a moment, he seemed almost untouchable, like a man who had never been threatened in his life. Dante took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Castellano," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Castellano slowly turned to face him, his expression calm, almost amused. "So, you finally made it, Dante," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an air of superiority. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me." Dante didn't flinch. He had been preparing for this moment for too long. "I didn't forget," he said coldly. "I just had to make sure everything was in place before I came for you." Castellano's smile widened. "You think you can just waltz in here and take me down? You really believe you're in control of this situation?" Dante's gaze hardened. "I don't believe anything. I know. This ends tonight." Castellano's eyes darkened for a moment, the calm demeanor slipping just slightly. "You've made a mistake, Dante. You think this is about power, about territory? This is about control. And you," he paused, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've never understood what true control is." Dante stepped forward, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. "You'll never understand that I'm not playing your game anymore," he said, his voice low and filled with quiet fury. "This city belongs to me, and when I'm finished with you, there won't be anyone left to stop me." Castellano's smirk faltered, replaced by the cold realization that his empire was collapsing in real time. But Dante wasn't finished. "You've been hiding behind your empire of lies for too long. It's time for you to face the truth." Castellano opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Dante moved. The final battle had begun, and it was time to end it once and for all. Dante's eyes never left Castellano, his mind sharp and clear. The silence between them hung heavy, like a looming storm waiting to strike. Castellano, once so confident, now seemed a fraction of the man he had been just moments ago. His empire, his carefully constructed world, was slipping away. Dante had no intention of letting him escape. He had been patient, gathering the pieces, waiting for this very moment. Now it was time to end it all. Castellano straightened, his expression hardening, but there was no denying the fear that flickered in his eyes. "You think you've won, Dante?" he sneered, though his voice wavered slightly. "You're wrong. You can't defeat me. I'm untouchable. I have the city in my pocket." Dante stepped closer, his presence overpowering, his voice unwavering. "You were untouchable, Castellano. You were the ghost in the shadows, but the truth is, you never understood how to control the real power." Castellano's face twisted in anger. "You're a fool. You think I'm the problem? I built this city from nothing." "You," Dante interrupted, his voice cold as ice. "No, you took everything. You ruined lives to build your empire, but now it's crumbling. You lost before you even realized it." Castellano took a step back, his eyes wild with disbelief. "You can't do this. You'll regret this, Dante. You don't know what you're dealing with." Dante's hand tightened around the gun in his holster. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with. You're not a king. You're a parasite. And tonight, you're done." He moved, fast and precise, pulling the gun from his holster. Castellano took a few more steps backward, raising his hands in surrender, but it was too late. Dante had already made his decision. Castellano had become a liability, someone who had outlived his usefulness. Dante aimed carefully, his finger barely brushing the trigger. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the stillness of the room, the tension that had been building for so long. But then, the sound of a gunshot shattered the silence. Castellano crumpled to the floor, his body hitting the ground with a dull thud. Dante stood there, his gaze unwavering, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The battle was over. The city, which had once belonged to Castellano, was now Dante's again. But it wasn't a victory that brought him relief. It wasn't about the power or the territory. It was about the message. He had shown the world what happened when you underestimated him. He had proven that no one was untouchable. Dante's thoughts drifted briefly to Jasmine, the waitress who had warned him, who had seen the danger before anyone else did. She had saved him in ways he couldn't yet understand. But that would have to wait. The fight for his empire was over, but the game would never truly stop. As he turned toward Marco, who had been watching quietly from the corner, Dante nodded once. Marco understood. "It's done, boss," Marco said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything that had just happened. "It's over." Dante didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, the lights of the city spread out before him, almost like a reflection of his own journey. He had fought for this. He had lost people, gained enemies, and made sacrifices. But in the end, he had held on to what mattered. His empire, his legacy. He had no intention of letting it slip away again. "The city belongs to me now," Dante finally said, his voice firm, his gaze unwavering. "And anyone who thinks they can take it from me will learn the same lesson. I don't lose." Marco didn't question him. Instead, he gave a sharp nod, acknowledging the unspoken truth between them. They were done with Castellano, but there was still much work to do. The underworld never rested, and Dante's grip on the city was only as strong as the alliances he built. But now, more than ever, he knew that no one could take him down. Not now, not ever. And with that, Dante turned and walked out of the room, his steps purposeful, his mind already focused on the future. The game was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Dante knew he was in complete control.